Welcome to the Tenet Podcast. I'm Todd Pearson, here with my friend and partner in Denver, Colorado, Wes Brown.
Oh my God, it's day 2 of Denver. I won't say post-pandemic, mid-pandemic, post-first round, beginning of the second round. I don't know, but...
Right in the thick of it.
Right in the thick of it.
The belly of the beast.
Yeah. And I keep threatening this might be my last podcast, but I'm still hanging in there, people. So keep your fingers crossed. Say a prayer. Shout out to Barb and Tonette. I know they're kind of freaking out about a little bit about this, but God love them. So
we are sitting in the beautiful yard of an incredible artist, Denver artist, Ron Hicks. Ron, how are you today?
I'm doing wonderful. It's not hot yet, so that's like a good thing.
Right, because it can be a scorcher.
Yes. Once the sun goes that way, it gets a little bit, it gets a little hot.
Yeah, and no wind, slight breeze. Beautiful day to do this. Yes. And thanks for letting us come to your house and sit in your yard, and the grass is just beautifully green. It's just
My
awesome.
pleasure. You guys improved it. Yeah, actually. Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome.
I am not the green thumb. Just
well, now you have yard gnomes in your yard because we're here. Unfortunately, we won't be here tomorrow, but so if the neighbors should come running just to check out the yard gnomes.
We could just stand... we could stand guard in Ron's yard.
There you go.
We could dress up.
That'd be great.
Oh, my God.
Oh, all right. We're getting silly here.
All right.
Ron, it's so good to see you. Like Wes already elaborated. You know, we're happy that you're willing to take some time with us on a Sunday and have a talk about your art. We initially got exposed to your art via the Coors Western art sale, and I was just incredibly taken with it. And then, of course, I went on a tour with our mutual friend Rose Frederick. And, you know, she talked about some of the artists in the gallery. I'm like, we need to talk to Ron at some point. And as has happened numerous times in conversation with other artists, your name has come up quite frequently. So,
well, and I want to say something too. So the Coors Western Art Show is, I think, episode 11. So early in our podcast, right? And you were like top of the list from then on. Like, we need to get Ron Hicks on. I mean, you've been at the top of that list, and then other people have come and gone, and you know, we're wonderful interviews. But we are so excited to have you, just because you were like right at the top of the list early on. So
I appreciate it. I'm happy to be here and excited to share.
You were on that short list, and for a while when this happened, we had to pivot to the Zoom platform. And we were like, I have this group of artists I've been saving because I wanted to do it in person. And it was really great that it worked out this weekend, that we're actually able to do this in person, socially distance, and have this interview. So I got to mention this because if I don't, my wife will be sorely disappointed. You were born in Columbus, Ohio.
Yes.
So I'm a fellow Ohioan,
Yes.
and I tell my wife all the time, everything great comes from Ohio.
And you're absolutely right. And I would like to add this, especially, I hope this part airs, to my wife, who is from Michigan.
Ooh.
Yes, we have our own little dialogue. I toilet papered her closet one time. That whole OSU Michigan thing.
oh my God, that's awesome.
I knew that's where this was going. That's awesome.
My God, that's
Yes,
awesome.
that's for my wife too.
So born in Columbus. How long did you live there before you moved to Denver?
Well, a short stint. My parents actually moved here when I was 2, but we moved back when I was probably 13.
Okay.
Yes.
And what was the cause of the move to Denver, and what made you guys move back to Columbus?
Well, I just know my parents, they decided that Denver was a good place to live. And I think my father had relatives or friends in the area, and he had visited, so he thought it would be a a good place to stay. And he was right. Denver, especially at that time, it wasn't too fast. It wasn't too slow. It was just sort of right, in the middle. And it was a good place to grow up in. And then, unfortunately, my parents got a divorce, which is what caused the move back to Columbus when I was right around 13.
That's a tough time to move too. I would think.
It's horrible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Age-wise.
Yes. It's a the whole dynamic, especially getting situated, because once we moved, we moved close to the this downtown Columbus, and then getting acclimated to that school system, and then when we finally found a home, we ended up being further west. So I went from Colorado school systems to not knowing anything about what was going on in Columbus, and then having to move again, so there was like these two jumps in, right at that time. So it was an interesting period. And I appreciate the whole art thing, because for me, it was like that glue that held me together, because when I could get away from, those things that were happening at the time, you get your divorce and moving and then moving again, art was a constant for me,
You were able to kind of find some solace in immersing yourself in your art at that time?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And from childhood on up. I mean, I started out very, very early. As a matter of fact, my mother was an artist, but she didn't quite take it to, what I've done. It was more of and I might be dating myself, but there was this Time Life magazine. If you could draw Tippy the Turtle in the famous artist school, you too could be a famous artist. So she took that correspondence course.
Oh, that's awesome.
And I would always peer through these magazines or books, these big black and yellow books, I should say, and draw some of the things that I saw, in the book. So that's kind of like where I got the whole start on the art thing.
And about how old were you when you realized that you had this talent that you could draw really well?
I was like 4 or 5 years old when I was flipping through those books.
Wow.
Yeah. And as a matter of fact, I tell this from time to time when I'm out. In kindergarten, when you're asked to draw what it is you think you want to do when you get big, and I had two choices, and I split my page in half, and one half was the artist, and the other half was a tire changer. That's what I called it, because I really liked Hot Wheels and tires and cars.
Yeah. Oh, that's funny.
So I'm glad we went with the art thing. Not that there's anything wrong with changing tires, but I'm just not good at it.
I think Big O Tire's hiring too, by the way, just in case you change your mind.
They would not want me to do that. I'm the knuckle buster. I know they have tools for that now, but
oh, that's funny.
It wasn't fun back then.
And so what age were you when you decided that, I'm going to seriously pursue this as a career path?
The art thing for me was always and always. As a career path, I probably would say, as I got into my, high school years, I had a number of teachers that were like, hey, this guy's got something going on here. We need to push him into these, various art shows, things of that nature, because they knew that there was some talent there. And I didn't know if I necessarily thought of it as a career, kind of growing up, but I just knew it was something that I enjoyed doing. And I was able to, I will say it like this. I was able just to do it. So it felt like it was just in my DNA. So when I started talking to some of my good friends when I was a younger kid, because we started planning this whole college thing out when I was in my elementary school, that's when I started to like, gosh, I knew I wanted to go to college or something, but I just didn't know what it was going to be. And after I got into high school, that's when I really said, I think this is something that I want to do. And of course, you hear those stories about, the whole starving artist thing and, why would you want to do that? You need to put your efforts in another area. And of course, I ignored that because I think even though I couldn't put a name to it, but it was a passion of mine at that point. And so that was larger than any, desires to do anything else. So.
And you had a lot of encouragement from these instructors in high school that saw this talent in you, and then a lot of encouragement, I imagine, from your parents as well?
Oh, most definitely. My Again, my mother was an artist, so she was always, making sure that I had supplies, things of that nature. My teachers, and starting in elementary school, I could even, the desks that they used to have, you could sit in, it was like a unidesk and they were made out of wood. And I would start in one corner at the beginning of the year in each of the classes that I had. And they used to frown upon, at that time, you drawing on your desk. But for some reason, they were like, okay, well, wait a minute, this guy's got something going on here. You go ahead and keep that on there. And then this mural would start like in one corner and move all the way across the top of my desk. Oh. And they'd allow me to do it. Now, as to what happened to those things, I'm not sure. Maybe at the end of the year, the people that were cleaning up said, okay, it's, we're out of here. But each year I was able to kind of do that. And my teachers didn't say, hey, stop that. And so as I got into my high school years, there was definitely a push to get me into, and there was like these art shows in Ohio, and I won a few of them, and in Michigan that they put my work into, and in some of the drawing and painting categories, I took some of the top honors. As a matter of fact, I received a just shy of a full ride scholarship to after high school to go to the Columbus College of Art and Design. So it was rewarding, and it was an opportunity to actually go to school and do what I wanted to do.
Did you get a degree from there?
No, and I'll tell you what happened. So, in my second year, I decided to leave, and I actually came back here to Colorado, where I have resided since, and I ended up going to the Colorado Institute of Art. So there was this, move to Columbus, Ohio. And then, my parents moved back, and I was going to school there for a while. And I came back to visit one year. And for me, and this is nothing against the Midwest, but Colorado has over 300 days of sunshine. And, when I came back, I was experiencing this like moment. I was like, gosh, I miss Colorado so much. And so even though I did have that situation, squared away, it was, again, I've always lived by this, like my heart and even in my work. So if my heart says, you need to turn this way, I turn that way, and I kind of listen to it. So I decided to, move back to Colorado and finish my studies here.
And how was that? Because that's my old alma mater, and that's a very commercial art school, not
Yes.
really focused on the fine arts.
Well, the crazy thing about the Colorado Institute of Art experience was this. Yes, you're right. But along the pathway, I kept hearing these voices, and they would be either, counselors or people that were in the organization. They were saying, hey, you got to make sure that you're able to do something when you get out. So I figured, well, if nothing else, maybe the graphic side of it will be, an area that I could move into. And so at the time, the Colorado Institute of Art offered, studies in that area. So I didn't really, I thought it was a good match for the future. But what I found when I got to the Institute, there was this teacher there. His name was Rennie Bruin, the most amazing person at the time for me, and very influential. And he was the one that started to put me on this path of the way I kind of think now. And not that he guided every single brushstroke and things of that nature, but he got me to think more abstractly about what I was doing with my work. I used to think when I graduated from high school and got into college that, if you could draw something exactly the way it was, you could take it from one area and place it into another area, then you were an artist, and that was it. But when I got to this class, we started talking about visual ideas and approaches and seeing things in more of an abstract way. And so I started to realize at that point, I was like, wait a minute, I'm getting this thing all wrong. It's not solely about, how well you can articulate something, but there's this heart, mind, body, and soul thing that goes into your work, as well. And it's taken me up until, now and I'm still in the middle of this, trying to fully realize what the parameters of this dynamic is, if there is a a parameter. It just keeps going. Once you go to a certain level, there's always an area to grow in another direction. So for me, he was a shining star inside of the my experience at the Colorado Institute of Art, and there was a number of other instructors there that had that same mindset. Lynn Kirscher, he's like a sculptor here in Colorado, and he was another one that was very encouraging and really had that mindset of follow your heart mentality. So when I got into this whole new dynamic of thinking, it just opened up the doors for me.
You also, I'd read where, and maybe this is Mr. Brune?
Yes.
Had looked at your art, and I don't know if this is the particular instructor, but I'd read that he kind of looked at your art and he saw that you were more of a fine artist, a painter, as opposed to commercial route. And he kind of, was that the gentleman that kind of guided you to say, hey,
Yes, Rennie was. I remember coming to class, and this was back when, in my experience, because I had a number of oil painting classes, and there was more of this intimidation at that time with some of the instructors. It was kind of like, I'm drawing, he's right behind me. Please don't tear my paper up, because I've seen it. Come by, it's like, what are you doing? And so I remember thinking that I was doing I brought one of my illustrations in, and I said, because I had an illustration class, and I remember bringing this illustration in, and it was a Tinkerbell spreading magic dust all over this figure. And I brought it to him, and I placed it in front of him. I said, check this out. And he was kind of like, he looks at it and sizes it up, and he goes, well, this is okay, but it's irrelevant. And, talk about getting stabbed in the heart. So at first, my juvenile mind said, what do you know? Only to myself, of course, because it was still an intimidating situation. And he said, it's irrelevant because you are a painter. And then he walked off. And I sat and pondered over that and still had that thought in my mind. And shortly after that, I started to come to the realization of what that actually meant to me. And the desire to transfer information from one spot and put it in another spot became the last thing that, in terms of importance for me. So then that began my search for, well, if it's not about that, then what is it about? And that, I think, is one of the most important things, that artists can, in my opinion, and this is just me and my experience, of course, you can take on. Because if you start out and once you learn either a style or a technique or something, and you go, okay, that's the end all, I'm done, I'm finished, this is what I'm going to do forever. And not saying if there's anything wrong with that, but sometimes you can close off your entire, you just don't know where you could take something if you just allow yourself to be open to, taking in, different ideas, exploring, and things of that nature. So I knew for me that it started to eat at me. It's like, I know it's not just this, then what is it? And that's where I started to grow. That's
a great question. The fact that you're asking, what is it?
Yes.
And because it, like you said, it kind of takes you down a different path because I think people in general, if they never ask, then what is it? They just are on this.
Exactly.
I thought that was a wonderful insight.
Yeah, you become a very linear thinker. And if you're thinking about like painting, oil paint, you become a linear painter. And you don't look outside of for anything else. So I grew up, and when I started in Columbus, Ohio, I was in a very, very traditional program, where it had an atelier style or esque kind of way of doing things, where you had certain things you did at certain times and how you studied. You started out and, actually you weren't even allowed to look at a figure or anything like that until you got through all your drawing and charcoal studies. And then you moved, slowly into coloring and other things of that nature. But if I was to say, hey, you know what, this is the end all, and I'm not going to explore anything outside of this, then where does that put you? And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, because there are people that have taken just that concept and that idea alone and created some of the most beautiful art that you'll find. But your path, I'll say it like this, is that necessarily everyone's path? Let's put it that way.
Right.
And if it's not your path, then it goes back to my question. Well, then what is it?
Right.
And that's where I've been, and I'm not going to say stuck, because I think that question is something that has moved me throughout my entire career. And I think it will continue. Now, there's always this string, I will say, that carries from one moment to the next moment, because there was this period early in my studies, as after I met him, we have a local artist here. His name is Kwang Ho. You probably have, well, maybe you haven't, but if you've not heard of him, he actually studied under Rennie Bruin as well. And I remember seeing, he had like this year-long class that he was teaching. And I said, I want to be a part of this, because it was based off of these visual approaches and these ideas that, I had been studying with Rennie Bruin. And so it allowed me to get in there and really dig into some of these things on a different level as well. So that took me to another level. And so here I am. And I could get into like this whole technical dialogue about what that experience was like. But even today, it makes me go back and question like everything. And even the whole idea of how I approach these visual approach ideas, because anything that you focus in and give too much energy can be another box. And what I mean by that is, like, say, for example, in my early studies, it's just like, hey, there's this whole grisaille way of painting, and that's the end all. And I just said, okay, well, that's it. Then my tendency is like not to explore anything else.
Right.
And we leave it at that.
Right.
And that becomes a box, because then you're sort of like your whole world revolves around what's inside that. And again, speaking for myself, that's not satisfying. I want to continue to, absorb other people's work, so I really had this affection for some of the impressionists, some of the abstract artists, some of the abstract expressionists, so all of these, dynamics started to intertwine itself. And I started to see how all of these things had this commonality there, going back to my earlier studies of the visual approaches and things of that nature. I was like, wait a minute, all of this is connected. So a lot of people were running around going, I'm an abstract artist. That's it.
Right.
And then the people who were realists or painted in realism or representationally, they were like, okay, we're in our camp. Right. And there was never like this, cross contamination ish. I mean, people have done it over the years, but right. There's always been this, you either are or you aren't, right. kind of mentality. And so, as I continued to develop, I started to see, wait a minute, there's more to this story than just these different camps. It's a bigger family, and we are just parts of the same family. And I like to use the analogy of my body, and it's almost like saying, that my hands don't belong to this body. They play an integral part. I would love to keep them, and my head too, because it all works together. So when I started, studying some of these other things, I started finding these commonalities and then started to express myself in those. And that's kind of where I am, with my work today, is like sort of playing around with those ideas.
Yeah, that's incredible.
We mentioned earlier in the podcast that Wes and I were first exposed to your work at the Coors show. Mm-hmm. How many times have you been in that show?
I think this last year was at my third or fourth. I have to go back. I think it's 4. Yes. Okay. This will be my 4th.
Are you in that show this year?
Yes, I will be in this year.
Excellent.
And there's the funny thing about that show is, it's called the Coors Western Art Show. And I remember when I was talking with the curator, Rose, and she was like, why haven't we had you in the show? And I go, I don't know. And then I started to think after we had our conversation, I was like, would I even fit in this show? And then after talking to Rose a few times, I would absolutely fit. Because, when you started thinking about the concept of what Western art, especially if you look at it in a more contemporary way, or that encompasses a broad area of territory. And so me, again, being on that more linear path that sometimes people, I thought, well, gosh, a Western art show, well, that's, I'm thinking like cowboys, like Indians. And I know it's kind of rough to say it like that, but I'm thinking barns, that's what I was thinking at first. And that's all you would get out of that situation. And I remember the first year that I got in there, I started to even, go, well, what kind of work do I have that would sort of lend itself to that sort of theme? So I put in work and we sold the work. But I remember Rose coming by the studio, and she happened to be looking at some of the work that I had in my studio. And she was like, I love this. And she's like, I want to see more of this. And I was like, are you sure? Are you giving me permission just to truly what I've been preaching, like be me and just put whatever it is that my contribution to the West is in this venue? And she's like, absolutely. As a matter of fact, not only would am I saying that, I'm really saying it. And so that year I said, okay. And when I brought the pieces out, she really liked the pieces that I brought to the show. And I didn't know if it was going to be something that would be marketable or if anyone would have interest in it. As a matter of fact, the thing that I'm doing now is sort of some things that I kind of had tucked in my studio. So I really never had any intention to actually push it out into the public's eye, because it was, increasingly becoming more of a personal thing for me. And there was this emotional vibe running through the content, the things that made up the piece that, with how I applied some of the abstract shapes and the brushwork and the texture. So all of these things started to come together, and it was really personal, but I had them just kind of like tucked into the studio. And the same thing happening with one of my art dealers here. He happened to come to the studio, and he was picking up, and he was like, hey, what do you got going on in the corner over there? And I was like, oh, it's just some things I'm working on. And he goes, oh my God, these are amazing. Can I take a couple of these? And he took them, to his gallery, and he immediately got sales on them. And he was like, is this something that you're kind of working on? I was like, well, yeah, I've been like slowly working on these pieces and tucking them away for myself. But if you want to take them, then yeah, certainly, you can. And what I learned from that is, well, I shouldn't say learn from, it's okay to let yourself be who you are as an artist. And then I had a number of gallerists across the country, start to see some of the things. And Instagram has been a great tool, because a lot of them saw, and first of all, I have to say, for me, Instagram is like torture, and not in a bad way. I first thought the whole idea of social media is like, what kind of content could I put out there that anyone could possibly be interested in? So my first attempts were just some crazy things like what kind of tea I had in the morning, and I thought, okay, this is stupid. I'm not posting anything else. But when these pieces started to come up, I decided I'm going to start posting some of these on Instagram. And a number of the gallerists started seeing some of these pieces, and they were like, hey, what are you doing here? And at first I thought it was like, hey, what are you doing? But it wasn't really a, hey, what are you doing? It was a, hey, what are you doing? Yeah. So more of them started to seep out. And what happened for me is when there's these moves in my career or things that I think that I should be following, there's always an internal battle that goes on. It's like, well, I got to stay on this path. This is, what I think I should be doing. And then there's the inside going, yeah, but you love doing this. And your heart, mind, soul, and body is telling you, I need to be doing that. And so when I wasn't doing some of the other pieces, I would jump back on some of these ideas that I was placing down on the canvas and saying, hey, this excites me. So the point I'm getting to is it started to give me a little bit more permission, so to speak, to continue to, push some of these things out. And that was a bright spot for me.
Kind of a blessing.
Yes.
Are you intrigued by how that works and what people gravitate towards in your work?
Well, I used to worry about that a lot, and this is not to take that away from anyone that collects, but I think that the more I stopped trying to figure out what someone else wanted to see and really concentrate on what I was supposed to be doing, people seem to fall into that dynamic. They follow you into your path. And so the thing, if you're asking me a question about that, I'd say the thing that intrigues me is that there are people that are willing to, follow you through your ups and downs and your turns. For the most part, there are some people that, really, like if they went back to say 5 or 10 years ago, what I was doing, they would go, oh my God, this, I really love what you're doing. And I did have people go, if this is working, why would you do this?
Right.
And my response has always been, I have no choice. Let me rephrase that. I do have a choice. I could choose to paint in a more pretentious way. When your heart and your mind and soul is telling you to do this, and then you go, I'm just going to do this thing over here that I know is super safe, and I could keep regurgitating this thing over and over and over and over again, and it'll be just fine. To me, that's a pretentious way of painting. I'm not knocking it again because, you have to do whatever you have to do to survive or make a living or whatever makes you feel happy. But I just think that for soul's sake, that inner you that has to survive, if you get to the end of your life and you look back at what you've done, can you get to that point and say, you know what, I exhausted everything that I could and I lived, in a true way? Or do you look back and you say, well, I kind of wish I would have followed that path? And for me, I'm trying not to live with any of those regrets. And I know it has to be a delicate balance because you don't want to flip the cart and then all of a sudden, you have nothing. But you still can't live it in fear of the change.
Right. So it's kind of interesting is when we were interviewing Bill Thomason, we talked about Thomas Kincaid, the painter of light, and, very commercial and, and found his niche or whatever you want to call it and just really worked it and was very successful at it.
Yes.
But then you take a painter like you but was he being authentic to himself? Like, was he painting what Rose would say? Was he following his voice or finding his voice? He found something very commercial that worked. And, congrats for that because he had stores all over the world, all over the country and malls and stuff. But then I think what you're doing is you're following your voice, as Rose would say, or your authentic self. And I think that's more, more satisfying in the end.
Absolutely.
So.
And I've seen some of Kincaid's, older work where he was actually, he's actually a great painter.
Yeah.
And some of them were very different from what you'd see on the commercial side of it. You can see echoes of what he's doing. I can't say it was inauthentic because it's hard for me to get inside that person's mind, or heart, or soul.
Right.
But what I will say is I know the temptation is when you are, having that sort of success, turning the boat is a little bit different. Because you probably have a whole lot more to take into consideration than if you're just doing it from a place of, I don't want to say nothing, but, of lesser means, let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is. It's a bigger ship to steer, isn't it?
Yes. And you have to look at it like this. There's this responsibility that you play a big part of because, not only is it your work out there, you got to think about how many employees that he employed. And, and if you're the kind of person that has this heart and soul and goes, gosh, if I say all of a sudden, I'm just like, I'm not doing that anymore. You guys go have to figure out what you need to do. I'm moving on to this.
Right.
There's that dynamic you have to take into consideration too. It's like, you can't just say, I'm done. And then your heart belongs to people, belongs to things, it belongs to the world, so you have to take that all into consideration. So it's not as easy.
That's beautifully put. Yeah. Well articulated. Thank you. Yeah, that's good.
Going back to the Coors show, do you already know what you're going to show in that show for this year?
No, I don't.
Okay.
Yes.
I was curious about that.
Because I am in the West and a painter of the West, it's going to be whatever my heart, mind, and soul says to do at this time. And I think one of the things that I am going to do is I want to work on a larger scale with this next piece. So, it may be a piece that's larger if I can manage the time to do that. And it's coming up here pretty quickly. So a lot of these paintings, they can take months to execute because I'm dealing with this these layers and layers of thick paint versus thin paint, and so there's this back and forth that goes on during the course of this process. So it takes time to really fully discover one of the pieces. And because I'm really working, with the heart, I can only stop when I think I'm supposed to stop. And sometimes people might go, is that finished? And my mind says, if my heart says it's finished, then it's finished. And I'll know what that is when I see it. So yes, so we will be in the Coors, and we are still working out exactly what that's going to look like. And it could be a byproduct of see, what I've been doing lately is taking in a lot of, things that are happening, currently. And it's hard for it not to seep in a little bit into your inner self. And it's most certainly, if it does that, it will spill out into my work in some sort of way, even if it's not readily apparent. As I mentioned earlier, some of my representation of shapes and the way that I attack the canvas is a direct response to some of those things. So you might not see it readily, but it'll be there. I'll say in spirit.
Right. Yeah.
You had 3 pieces in the show last year, or did you have more?
Yes.
Okay. How did you go about choosing those pieces? Did you paint just like you're talking about now, where it kind of came to you and you decided this is what I'm painting for this particular show?
Yes.
Okay.
And the thing that I follow for whenever I'm putting out, works to like some of the galleries that I'm represented by. The odd thing about this is it's if I'm truly being true to myself, it's very difficult to put time frames on these works, because I might have a gallery that says, hey, we've got this such and such coming up and blah blah blah, and I'm like, okay, I think I'll be a part of it. In particular, like one man exhibitions. So you put this energy out, and if I'm living true to that, what I'm telling you, it's not until I'm able to release myself from the painting to when it's actually done. So, and that just varies from painting to painting. I could spend as much time on a small, like 12 by 12 as I do on a 50 by 50. There's no rhyme or reason to how it
So
works.
are you working on multiple projects at one time, or?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
And I started to introduce that into my practice. The first and most important thing to me is working when I think I should be working, because I went through years, because I started out as an illustrator before the whole painting thing kicked off. On the illustrative side, especially when you're dealing with like companies, and they have deadlines, and it's like, hey, we need this by blah blah blah, and we need this, and your sketch should be done here, and you have all of these things, and there's a timed kind of thing, and you have to be done by that time. And so trying to move that into the painting side of it was a little bit more difficult as I started to understand myself and discover what my working process should be. So I found myself trying to push those same ideas into my paintings, and they didn't always work, because I found myself working and not to the benefit of the painting. Because in the end, I might, work on these passages, and I might stay on a painting and say, I'm going to stay on this painting till it's done. And then after a whole 8-hour day of painting, to scrape it off, because it's just like, this is not right. And my wife would be like, why did you do that? It's just not right.
Right.
So I've learned to work and listen to myself again. And when it's time to slow down or step back, let the painting breathe, and then proceed after that.
Wow. That's well said. I just love that. That's great. The fact that like you said, let the painting breathe a little bit and give it some space and some time. I guess I didn't think about that. So it's kind of interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, it really is, because the tendency, and this goes back to my earlier painting days when I considered myself more of an illustrator, I guess. You could start in one corner and work your way all the way across. That was your end product. It's like I start from A and I'm all the way over to Z, and then I'm done. I think when you're thinking on the more artistic side, and I think there is truly a difference from someone who paints and someone who is actually an artist. And I think the difference is much like you would see someone that's like a composer versus someone that just simply reads music. And especially when you're a composer for a large orchestra with many, pieces to it, because not only do you have to know what you have to know what everyone knows and what their role is, in a particular piece that of course is directed by your vision. So there's all these moving parts, whereas, the tuba player is just like, well, there's my tuba music. And not to say they don't have a bigger role, but right. A composer has a bigger responsibility. And I think that's what the difference for me from like someone who's just painting and someone who's truly being an artist. An artist is thinking like an artist. So, and they're much like the composer, where there's all of these things that they're putting into their work that's a little bit different from just transferring information.
Yeah.
A lot of your work that I've seen, you work in a very muted palette. Mm-hmm. And it looks like, at least in some of them that I've seen, texture as well. What was the decision to work in that, that muted color palette?
Well, it goes back to, I did several studies when I was a younger artist, and I really dealt with, value and shape and color as different things to study. And when I went to start studying color, it goes back to that whole orchestra or director of an orchestra. In order to get a point across, you have to have everything working together in order to make that statement. So if my color is too loud, and it's against what I'm trying to convey, then it's anti-statement. So I really started to take into consideration, how color, saturation or desaturation, value, how all of that, tone, if you will, works, in my message. So many of my paintings, even though there's a figurative aspect to it, the figure serves a larger part of the painting. It's just a larger mass of shape, in my abstract design. I really consider myself like an abstract artist, to be quite honest with you. And I jokingly say with representational tendencies, because, when you break down something on a two-dimensional surface, really, you're just putting either one shape down or you're doing like millions of shapes to create maybe the illusions of reality. But the reality is there's just a bunch of shapes that create the illusion that there's something real there. So I like to think of myself, and that was one of the main things, as I was talking when we first started having this chat about my earlier training and meeting like Rennie Bruin. It's, when you start to look at things a little bit differently and you start seeing things in terms of shape, value, edges, texture, color, and not, hey, you're a person or that's a pot or that's a flower, then you start to see things differently. And so I think that's what I really started to do, is to break things down into these abstract shapes and movement. And so my figures, they serve as a part of some of these abstract shapes and dynamics. So the color aspect for me was really me realizing that in order to say something about color, and I think it hit me at one point when I was in class and I was looking at this young lady, a model that I was painting. She had this really super red dress on. And when I started to work on this, because I didn't really pay attention to the color and the value of the things that were around her, I was like, I cannot get this red. This red is so intense. Why can't I get the red? And it's because, and I soon discovered, it's like, wait a minute. It's because everything else is screaming and your red will never be the red, because we don't have, I'll say this, we're out in the sun right now, right? We don't have a magic sun brush. So I can't go up to my canvas and go, I'm going to paint the sun, because that color doesn't exist. So you have to paint, everything is all about relationships. So you have to paint the relationships. So I started on this path where I was using, a lot of desaturated color and challenging myself to see how far I could take that. And so I think when you see a lot of those more muted tones, that sort of stuck with me. And I think that in terms of how much chroma we use in our, I'll say in my paintings, versus what we actually see in reality, it's hard to make a representation of how colorful something is unless you have some of these muted tones. I just prefer to stay on that side of it because I have more leverage or room to move to make a statement if I'm in that range. Now, with that said, if that more muted tone becomes a part of my abstract dynamic, I have to keep it more on that side because it works better with the whole. If I was to go in and do a full rendition of, let's say, that figure and put like full chroma, then all of a sudden it may not work as a part of my dynamic. So therefore it becomes a loudspeaker. It becomes something that's like irritating to me. So that's what it is. It's all about the balance.
You mentioned earlier the representational work.
It's my neighbor.
He made some comment as he's riding by.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I should repeat it, but
we'll let it lie then.
Okay.
So your early work, you mentioned, was maybe a little more representational.
Mm-hmm.
And then you kind of evolved exploring the abstract. What was the impetus for that exploration into more of the abstract side of things?
Okay, so as I mentioned, when I came to the realization that it was something deeper than just this transferring of information, I started to see things more as these shapes and represented in my compositions. And so a lot of people might look at the sort of my transition now and go, oh my God, you totally flipped the script. But if you go back and look at my work, you'll see the underlying tone. You know, if you were to cover up like some of the faces, there would be this humongous abstract dialogue that's happening all over the background. So it didn't kind of just happen. This is just a progression. So that's why I'm saying I have this thread of things that are happening. So it started with me realizing that I got rid of the whole idea of this, and line is a concept, but I got rid of the idea of everything just being very, very linear, and that I see that we are all comprised of these chunks of shapes and masses. So I started divvying my backgrounds up into these shapes and relationships and seeing how they worked compositionally the best. And so, again, if you go back to one of my pieces and you cover up the faces, you'll see this loose abstract painting behind everything that represents reality, because when you have some of the reality with it, then you put two and two together. But if you were to probably cover some of them up, you'd go, okay, what's going on back here? Yeah.
I was looking at your paintings, and to me, they almost feel like thoughts that are flowing through the subconscious, kind of almost dreamlike, and like clouds that form in the sky, how they're like, they take shape and then they kind of dissipate and then start forming something else. For me, it kind of takes me on a journey of exploration of, I guess, emotion. And the more I spend, and this is to be said with a lot of painting, but the more I spend time with it, it starts to elicit different feelings and a different response, you know? Is there intention in that to the viewer, or is it purely that you're just channeling that particular emotion or feeling and putting it down on the canvas?
That's a good question. I think especially with the current body of work that I'm working on, it's truly my emotional dialogue that's being spilled out onto the canvas. And it is for viewer consumption. But with most of my work, I don't like to say, hey, this is why I did it and this is how you should perceive my work. I have a way of viewing myself as a person that just like opens up dialogue. And I know that most people would look at the work and go, well, what is this about? You know, I want to know what you are thinking about. And my observation of that thought is like, I really want to know what your observation of this is, because it's hard for you to operate someone else's mind. And I found many cases, and this has happened to me at art shows and things of that nature, where I'll have people say, well, gosh, I feel that this is about blah, 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 and this and that and that. And I go, and you're absolutely right. And I can't take that away from you. And the minute I go, well, you know what? That is so not it. This is what you should be thinking. It destroys their experience with that painting.
Yeah.
Then it becomes null and void. And so when someone thinks enough of a work to where they're willing to say, hey, you know what? I want to take this and I want to put this in my home. There's a reason for that. And it's not just because, oh, I think he painted pretty colors. I don't think that's solely it. There's sort of a connection I think that you have with a piece, and you're drawn to it for whatever those reasons are, and you take that home. I can tell you a quick story if you'd like. I've mentioned this in a couple of interviews, but I think it's important. I think when I first realized this, I was in a gallery and I was about to leave, and I just happened to come in the gallery to say goodbye to the owner right after an exhibition. And there was these two ladies looking at one of my works, and I walked in the front door, and I noticed that one of them in particular was visibly upset, and she had on mascara and she's crying. It was running down her cheeks. And then I heard her say something to the effect of, "This is a stoning." And this was when I was doing, more like romanticizing life, and I had these paintings that were, I thought it was about love, and I felt this need to go rescue my painting. So I introduced myself and I said, "Hey, my name is Ron Hicks. I just happen to be, about to leave and go back, home to my studio, to where I live." But I couldn't help but overhearing what you were saying. And I just wanted to let you know this is not about a stoning. And I went to this whole long explanation about, this young lady, she wants to be with her lover and she has fallen to the ground. Her 4 brothers are forbidding. It was this whole like scenario that I had painted. And she turned around to me and with, still kind of streaming, tears, she said, "I don't care what you say about this. To me, this is a stoning." And I stepped back and I looked at her and I said, "Duly noted." And from that day forward, I started having this realization. It's like, wait a minute, it is not my responsibility to dictate how you should feel about my artwork. You have to come to the table with something. Now, there are going to be those people that say, "Hey, this has to be about something, and you should let me know what that is." And I'm very hesitant, if you press me hard enough, I might dig into what that is. But sometimes it's even really personal for me as to why it's on the canvas. And so I become very hesitant to put that out there. My heart really says, have your experience with this. And I can't tell you how many times after a show I've had someone come up to me and go, "Hey, you know what? You were talking about this painting, how it emotionally affected you. You were talking about, how, this art thing is solace for you. And it touched me so. I feel like going, and some of them are artists. I feel like working now. You've inspired me to do this." Or they've come up, if they're non-artists, and said, "This is so beautiful. I love this piece, and I love it even more now," because some of them may have collected the piece. So I allow people to have their own experience with the work. And I think that's the best way to do it.
Yeah, and I think as a patron of art, and I tell this story more than once about abstract expressionism and stuff, and like I didn't get it. I didn't really truly get it until I started to expose myself to the actual painting, like Pollock. I use him a lot. I poo-pooed Pollock in college till I seen the first Pollock, right? Mm-hmm. And it gives you a different thing. And then doing this podcast has opened my eyes. And then just hearing what you said, I'm hoping our listeners that aren't necessarily artists, but like to look at art, or maybe they just, ran across this, but spend some time with a piece, especially if you don't understand it. Just look at it and try to see what kind of emotions is being evoked from you. And I think that's so important because I can easily go through a gallery, especially early on when I was in my 20s or whatever, and just kind of dismiss it, and perfect example. Todd and I watched Lifeline about Clifford Still. That's out on a documentary out. And I said, "Oh man, we need to go to the Clifford Still Museum." And Todd was like, "Didn't we go to there?" And I'm like, no. And then I was talking to my wife later and she goes, "No, we went." And then I started thinking, I'm like, oh my God, that's right. I forgot, but it didn't move me. But now, I know that the next time in the Clifford Still Museum, because number one, we've had that experience. The podcast has brought out more, I'm going to have an emotion that's evoked from me differently than that first time when I just kind of dismissed it. And I hope who's ever listening, like you're unsure about what abstraction is, abstract painting is, take a moment, sit down and really absorb it. Just let it be. Just be still and just look at it and study it. So thank you so much for telling that story because I think it's just on point that we just need to spend some time.
Yes.
And that your interpretation as the artist is one thing, but mine as the patron is just as valid. Absolutely. And is something else. In fact, one of the artists I think it was in the Clifford Still, basically or maybe it was the critic. Now I don't remember, but in there they said what sets Clifford Still apart is you and I can go in and sit and look at it, see different things. But what makes him great is I can come back again and see something completely different.
Yes.
So I just love that line.
Yes.
So,
and I actually concur. And it's really the whole reason I think when I was in my early in my career, that's why I changed, because I was like, wait a minute, I can't ignore this. And it makes me feel a certain way. What is it? If it's not that, what is it about? And that's where my whole world opened up. And I'm still exploring. And I don't even think I'll have a lifetime. And I don't think my lifetime is enough to explore it.
Right.
It really isn't.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I mean that from the bottom of my heart.
No, I trust me. I know exactly how you're feeling, because I had that same thing. I was like, oh my God. And, to the point where I was, having trouble driving, because I was like, then I started to see everything differently. Everything just started to look different to me. And so when I'm looking at, and honestly, we could be looking at the same person trying to paint the same model, and we'll see totally two different things.
Right.
And I think there's a beauty in that.
Yeah, most definitely.
On that note, that was a great question, Wes. Relationship. We just talked about relationship between the viewer and the art. How important is, and we've talked with other artists about this, how important is the relationship between artist and an art collector or someone that is experiencing your art in an exhibit or what have you? Is that to you as an artist, is that an important relationship?
Yes, I think it's great, because I think anytime you can connect with, someone aside from yourself, that gives you some sort of feedback about what you're doing, that's important. And I'm certain that from the flip side of it, from the patron or the gallery owner or whomever, they're seeking the same kind of relationship. So I think one feeds the other. You need both. Now, there is an argument to say, hey, because I've talked to some artists that say, you should paint your truth. It doesn't matter what, someone says or what someone thinks about it. And I guess there's some truth to that. It is, because you really shouldn't be painting, in my opinion, just solely for the market. But at the same time, sometimes, especially, and I can see the flip side, there are galleries or patrons that have a certain taste or things of that nature, and maybe there's a disconnect, and you have to take that up on, with another person, that sort of sees that connection. So, but in terms of an actual connection between, myself and a collector, I love the collectors that I've dealt with, because we have, whether I'm at one of my shows or I have repeat offenders, that have bought several paintings. I know that the paintings have gone to a great home, and someone who actually, and I can say this about at least 90% of my art, I've known, of the people who have bought some of these works, and I know that they've gone to great homes, and people that have them are not solely buying them just say, well, what's the market doing? Where's this guy going? No, it's because they truly actually have this connection with it. And that makes my heart feel great, I'm often invited to say, hey, if you want to come out and visit your paintings, just let us know. We've got a room for you, so it's
that's awesome.
Great. Yeah.
That is awesome.
Yeah.
And that's really kind of the highest compliment, right?
Absolutely. Yes. To me, and I've, been painting like full time for the past 20, 25 years or so, maybe even a little more. But it amazes me that, when you do have collectors that appreciate you enough to say, hey, I want to have this piece in my house. And it makes you feel really warm and happy, about those kind of transactions. And not that that's the sole thing, but, if someone appreciates your work enough to put it in their home, that really means a lot. Yeah.
you have a number of collectors, but you also have gallery representation as well. Is that true?
Yes. Yeah. So most of my work is sold through galleries. I do have some, a few collectors from years ago that, like I said, are repeat offenders, and most of them actually frequent the galleries. So it's sort of like that kind of a relationship for me. So I've talked to a lot of artists about this. There are a number of artists that are kind of doing it on their own, which to me, it's more difficult for me to do that because, you spoke a minute ago about this connection with collectors. Trying to gather that data and being, in that spot where you are switching hats constantly, you're marketing yourself, or you're trying to, get new collectors in, that's a hard balance to maintain, because you have to, switch hats, and it's very, very difficult. So as I mentioned earlier, like with doing this social media, the only reason I was on Instagram is because a buddy of mine, a good abstract art friend, said, "Hey, you need to be on Instagram." And I'm like, "Really?" And I said, "Okay, I'll do it. I don't know what I'm doing, but I'll do it." So he helped me set everything up, and there are people that respond on there. So it's good to get feedback, from actually people from all over the world, regarding your work. So,
well, we hear that time and time again with the social media. Have you sold pieces via Instagram or Facebook or whatever? Yes. Social? Okay.
Yes, I have. I had an old collector, and I had this painting that I had relegated to my or put in my private collection, and she called me up. She's like, "There's this painting you had," and it was probably about, I think at this time it was probably about 15 years or so ago. She says, "I love that piece, blah, 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 blah. I wish I could have da-da-da-da." And I was like, "Well, I have it right here." It was through Instagram. She's like, "Oh my God, is it still available?" And I was like, "Well, yes, it is." So, she bought a painting, that way. So it's a very valid thing. It's just that and I know some artists that are really like huge, they get on social media and they're able to, to handle those transactions, through their websites and things of that nature. But I have found for me, at least the way things are now, most of the gallery owners, they provide the service that I cannot do, and nor do I want to do, because it takes a lot to procure, the reputation, the time it takes to keep those relationships going, knowing your clientele base, and then knowing your artists, so you have this balance. It's just a whole lot. And I would certainly not want to run a gallery. That's a whole nother.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah, I just couldn't do it. But I appreciate them because they are needed. And sometimes you hear people give them the bad rap, like, "Oh, they're taking this and they're taking that." And I was like, well, some of them do a huge service, and there are some bad apples out there. Don't get me wrong. There are some that, have taken advantage of artists and things of that nature. And I remember years ago, I had a situation where I was talking to a collector like years after a sale. And I remember at that time, I think my paintings probably, they do good to top $250, And she's like, "Yeah, we bought this years ago and we spent," I think it was like $10,000 or something like that. And I was like, "What?" So that made me think, wait a minute, if you spent that kind of money on it and I only got what I would normally get out of the painting, something went wrong with that relationship. Yeah. So there are bad apples out there. Yeah. But once you have, and this is another relationship, we were speaking about relationships. I have an amazing group of gallery owners that I click with, they're like friends. You call them up, laugh, play, and we have that kind of a relationship. So it's not all business. It's a little bit of everything. So each time, and again, I get this warm fuzzies on the inside. Everything's about feelings with me. If I get with a director or a gallery owner or something like that, and I'm feeling that, those things, those vibes, as I call them, then I get that feeling on the inside that it's going to be okay, And of course, there's things you can do contractually to, to solidify that. But everyone that I work with has been top notch, and they continue to do their job, which is something I don't want to do again. And it just works. But I have heard that it's difficult, and for me, it's hard for me to give complete advice about this, because I've had the question, well, how do you get in the gallery? How do you do this? How do you? And to be quite honest, it's hard for me to tell you how to do that, because my situation, when I first started was, we were chatting a little bit earlier about my, and I'll just share this right now. One of my first shows was a 3-person show with three artists that I know, and we broke out the finest mustard pretzels that money could buy, and sparkling, some sparkling something drink. And this was so cheesy. We picked a date, and it was in December, and I'll never forget this, because the date we picked was on the day of our Parade of Lights here. And it just so happens we were right by the staging area for the Parade of Lights. So we were just like, what else could go wrong with this situation, But there were a few patrons that fought their way through, heard about the show, and showed up, and I was able to cover my cost of the mustard pretzels, because I sold a couple paintings. But it was like, I had a good friend of ours. He was an illustrator, and he, did a lot of work for Harley and things of that nature. And he had the most amazing work sitting around in the front of his studio, which was like a gallery, And so that's what we leased out. And then eventually they turned that into a gallery. And that's actually when I first met Rose, the curator for the Coors Western Art Show. She was the curator director there, and it was called the David Ewell Gallery. And she was like, hey, would you be interested? We were thinking about turning this into a gallery. Would you be interested in being a part of this gallery? And I was like, well, sure. And at that time, I was working for this company called Prime Star, which got bought out by DirecTV. So they did a lot of satellite dish for the rural areas, things of that nature, when it first started to be a big thing. And I remember going, well, sure, I'd be glad to do it. I think I gave them like 4 or 5 paintings for their grand opening. And that was that's probably my second gallery experience, because the first I was kind of telling you about, I had some, weird things happening with that. And so they sold all those paintings in their grand opening. So my first experience actually getting into a gallery wasn't me like pounding the pavement and trying to find, it was more of someone happened to be in a spot and saw something and said, hey. And what became of that is I sold those 5 paintings at that particular show, and they were like, hey, you should do a one-man show. And I was like, okay. But, I'm working for Prime Star, and I will get as many as I can when I can get them to you. So I think by the time the show came around, there was, like 26 pieces when it was all said and done. And they sold the entire show out.
Wow.
Yes.
Yeah, man.
Yeah. And so they were just like, well, why are you working at Prime Star? And I was like, well, it makes me happy. And I have a 401k and insurance. So yeah. I'm probably not going to, I'm good, So, but what happened with that one man show was there was this gallery that happened to be in for our Artist of America show that used to benefit the Denver Rotary Club. And so a director from it was the Meyer Gallery in Park City come down, and they called all the Ron Hickses in the phone book, and said, hey, if you are Ron Hicks, the artist, we want to represent you, because they actually bought 2 of the paintings, and I'm sure they took them and sold them for more than what, they were available for at that time. And so I called them back and I said, well, hey, I am available, but I work for Prime Star, and, I gave her the whole spiel that I gave, the David Ewell Gallery, and they're like, oh, that's okay. So I did a one-man show for them as well, and, about the same amount of paintings, and they sold that show out.
Wow.
And then, so they're just like, well, and why are you, and I was like, well, I've got my 401k and I'm working for Prime Star, and, went through that whole thing. So it wasn't until the David Ewell Gallery, when they had, some investors in that, situation. And they started looking and they were like, well, why isn't this guy painting full time? And then they said, hey, look, if you will stop working for Prime Star and, we'll pay you regardless of whether you sell a painting or not. And it will be equal to or better than what your salary at your Prime Star is. And I think what was happening is they had more confidence in what was happening than I actually did, because I took one step out into that world, and it was when I was a freelance illustrator. And I remember it was right after my first art job. I was working for this company called Whittico Advertising, and it was we had sales rep coming left and right, and imagine two new grads from school, and you're like, oh, whoa, a stat camera, what is this? We didn't see this in art school. It was like, well, figure it out. It was that sort of thing. Right. And then it was like, well, I don't care about all that fancy design stuff. All we want is Helvetica boat on these balloons. That's all you need to do. So it turned into this thing. It was like, yeah. So, so after I got away from that, and got into this new situation, the owners, and they decided that they were going to do this. And I said, well, this is a sign, if there's ever a time to do it, I can always go back to doing this. This is the time to do it. And right after I did that, I was able to not only produce work for the gallery that I started with, I produced work for the gallery that the gallery from Utah. And then I got a call from New York. And at first I thought, this is not real. And I'll remember, the owner director there, he said, hey, I've been following your career for quite some time. And these galleries were doing some advertising too. So he literally had a file on me, and I, when I flew out to meet him, he was like, oh, here's your file. And I was like, oh my God, you got everything. And I was like, how did you get this? I don't even have some of this, And, so I remember sending him out some paintings, and, it was an interesting thing. So he, I think I doubled overnight, with him, because he said, well, send me out like some works. So I think I sent him 5 paintings, and he said, when I sell them, we'll have a conversation after that. And so right after I hung up, he called me like the next day. He says, look, I sold all these paintings. And here's what I sold them for. And then after I picked my mouth up off the floor, I said, okay, so then there was another transition or a fork in the road. It's like, well, do you move up? And I did. And most of the galleries that were with me at that time stayed on. There were a few that, kind of dropped off because I was collecting, a few along the way. But each phase was never a phase where I actually had to go and take a portfolio in and actually do that kind of work. But I have heard stories of how these directors like to be approached. And sometimes it's not like cold calling, where you come in. So you really have to you call them up and ask, like, is this okay to do? Or try to figure out by some kind of means. But what you don't want to do is become, an annoyance at the very beginning. Right. Because then, that might not go that well as you continue to work through the process.
That's an amazing story.
It is.
Yeah. Wow. What a career. I mean, what a career movement.
Yes.
Quickly, it sounded like.
Yeah, it started, right, as a young artist, and it started to move up. And I was, from that moment that I moved, away from Prime Star, I was painting full time ever since then.
Wow. And
every now and then it's kind of odd. I see one of my directors, they actually work for an art organization here locally, and then I always see her every now and then. I go, you used to terrify me. So I have to give you my report on all my employees, and and that was another thing, working a job. And I thought, well, gosh, maybe I'll just because I had a little bit of management in my background because I worked for McDonald's through college. Man, my life has truly been blessed. I had this wonderful guy by the name of Reggie Jones. He owned a McDonald's here locally, and he was like, "Hey, whatever you want to do, Ron, we'll get you through school. You have a job, with me here." And then I said, "Hey, I need to take some time off." He was always accommodating. Do you want to own a McDonald's someday? And I was like, I don't know if I could do that. Now that I think about it, he does very well for himself.
Yes, they do.
But I've always had people, at the right time in the right place to kind of help get me through. So, you've heard that it takes a village. I kind of feel it. It really does. And I think that if we put out those positive vibes and stuff like that, you can kind of bring those in. I think when you're closed off and you're negative. I don't want this to be a commentary on that, but I do think it plays a big part in how you, what you receive.
Right.
I'm a big believer that you kind of get back what you put out there.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that's the sole reason people will go collect your artwork, but I think it helps.
Yeah.
So along the time, I've had these points where I've had people, say, hey, you know what, you got, because he introduced me to a lot of the people on the corporate level at McDonald's, and I did some work for McDonald's Corporation even, through the owner of this McDonald's. So each phase has been a step in the right direction.
Well, it's interesting. I think what's cool about it is you are open to yourself to see these opportunities when they come, and and I'm sure you toiled with it, but having an opportunity, a door open, as they say, and you recognizing it's open, and then having the courage to step through it, because it's easy to back away. And it's kind of funny. I've shot photography all my life since I was a little kid, and I've always told myself, which is a lie, I don't want to do it professionally because then it becomes a job. Mm-hmm. But I denied myself a passion to make money from a passion, which maybe would have served me better. So, but it's wonderful, to hear your story and to see that you have the courage to walk through those opportunities when you can. And I do believe if you put that out there, what you put out there will come back to you. I truly believe that. So thanks for sharing that. That's awesome.
And you can actually live your passion and not make it work. It's just when we have these preconceived ideas of what we should be for someone else's situation, and they don't see you for what you offer in your situation and how it could benefit their situation. That's when we run into this disconnect, because I think people are always striving to, like, gosh, that guy's making it over there. I need to figure, because I've actually had, people call me up and say, hey, I want you to mentor me. I want you to teach me how, what you know about this, and how do I do this, and how do I get here, and how do I do that? And, my response is always like, it's not that easy. If you look at it from the market side of it, someone has to want your work, right. Whether that be the collector, because it all revolves around who's collecting, because the gallery is a non-factor if you don't have collectors. And if you don't have something that the collector responds to, then the gallery owner has nothing. So, it's sort of like this cyclical, this big circle. My first thing is like, so what are you doing? And so if you start to pull out work, and I know we all have our influences and things of that nature, but if you start to pull out work that a gallery has 20 artists like you in it, chances are they might look at that and go, well, I already got that. And I got some really good advice from a gallery owner, and because I was, actually inquiring for a person that I knew, and he said, "Well, if you find a situation that doesn't have you, and sell yourself into that situation." But most people, and I'm not gonna say most people, but there's a lot of people that, say, "Gosh, I like what this person is doing stylistically," and then they'll sort of conform to that. And I know the argument is there's nothing new under the sun, and really, truly, there's not. I think that a lot of things that have been done, but I think the caveat to that is it hasn't been done the way your true self would do it. And if you could get to that point and let that be your expression, and then take that out, I think that's the whole ball of wax. It's hard for someone to be you in your emotional state and how you express what it is that you express. They can copy you, but they can't be you.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it takes the whole thing. I mean, the muted palette, like Todd was referring to, the work of the brushstroke is going to be different.
Yes.
Like you said, if you take two artists and paint the same subject, and you're talking about looking at the same subject, but if you take two artists and paint the same subject, it's going to look different.
Absolutely.
Even if they're trying to be very close to one another, it's going to look
Absolutely.
different. Yeah.
And you as a photographer, we're both artists, but you're going to totally see it differently than I see it. And there's things compositionally you'll respond to that are totally things that you that really kicks you in the pants, that may not work with me. I'm like, oh, that's cool. After I see it, because I have no doubt I would look at your work and go, oh my God, this is amazing. Because I love photography, by the way, in particular, black and white photography. And I'll see these images and say, oh my God, this artist is so amazing. But how would I approach this same subject matter at the same time? Completely different.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's talk about your work in more depth. You have this beautiful website, and for our listeners, I think you're really good about this, Wes, but I'll say the website. It's ronhicks.com, just like you think it's spelled, RONHICKS. And it's this beautiful website that you can check out. On that website, you talk extensively about who you are, which is great. I love that you have that on there. And then you represent your work in different series. You have 4 different series in there. And I was wondering if you'd be willing to talk about each one of those series.
Oh, sure.
So go ahead. I'm sorry.
No.
I was gonna say maybe start with the Ordinary People series and work from there.
Ordinary People. I kind of made these series sort of broad, and I may even add a few more as time goes along. I got away from the idea of doing it by date or something like that, because sometimes I'll start a series or a series of paintings that have like similar attributes, and then I'll move on to some other, things, and then come back to those. So they'll sort of, I'll put them into what I feel their category should be. But Ordinary People for me is really kind of what it states. It's this everyday, ordinary sort of connection with, it could be someone in a rural area, it could be someone on the streets. It's still that sort of connection that I have when I see these kind of situations, arise, and I sort of lump them into that, and my response to them. Let's put it that way. Yeah.
And then, go ahead.
No, no, you go ahead.
I'll put you on the spot, Todd.
I was going to jump in, and then I thought maybe you were going to add something. So,
how do you feel about it?
I think they're remarkable, and looking through those, I just think they're intriguing, like studies of these different people that you've either, like you said, come across or thought about. And in that, let me ask you this before we continue on. Are these people that you've actually met, or that these are people that just get that come to you and you get this image in your mind of what that particular person looks like, and you just respond to it?
So that would be an accurate statement, or I'll say the portion of that is the accurate statement. I do see people, and I respond to what I'm feeling at the time about this illustration of this person, I would say. But sometimes the model that I either choose for it could be a combination of several models or several sittings of different sittings that create this idea. So most of the people that you'll see, especially here recently, don't actually exist in real life. They are, again, another element for my composition, an excuse to explore composition. Now, with that said, I do think that there's something about their expressions. There's something about their the emotive things that come across when each individual comes in contact with one of the images that they put out there. So there is that connection that I think they do. But I'd like to think that they're heartfelt, emotional studies of life and relationships, and all of that. That abstract, the dynamic that we were talking about a little bit earlier sort of fits into there. And that's the only other element that I hadn't talked about yet, is there's this emotional element that goes into the whole entire piece that completes the puzzle. And I think without all of those, then the work wouldn't be what it is. Yeah.
So before I move on to the next series, I noticed in your painting, you definitely depict both genders, and sometimes it almost seems like it's non-gendered, but you definitely gravitate towards the feminine. Why is that?
I I think it started out earlier in a lot of my paintings, and I would paint men and women, children, whatever. But there was something about women, and I talked about this a little bit in a recent interview. I had a lot of powerful women in my life, growing up. In some of these interviews, I would talk about how my mother was like one of the first ones, and she was, women are nurturers. And they possess things that you can't always get out of a father-son bond or a male bond, because, my dad was more of a like, all right, yeah, you scraped your arm, get up, whereas my mom might be like, oh, let me help you out here. Even though she was strong, she still had that nurturing side to her. So I think a lot of the reason there's more women in it is because I'm really responding to some of those emotional ties that I've had with her. I've had several aunts. I had neighbors, because back when I was growing up, I had you're kind of raised by your neighbors too, so you really couldn't do anything because it's like, what are you doing? I'm going to tell your mama, and then all of a sudden you're like, so then you got to go home, and it's like, by the time you get there, it's already there. It's like, yeah, I did it. Yeah. So I think that seeps into some of these ordinary people. And so I gather these thoughts and things of this nature. And so when I'm in my element, which, each one of the series has a piece of the other series in it. There's a little piece of everyone and everything, because it's all, for me, this emotional baggage of things that I'm drawing from as well while I'm painting. So it's all coming from the same family when it goes out, but they seem to fit in certain categories more so than others.
So talk about the series that you have entitled Surfacing.
Well, Surfacing for me, and I think that it best describes, like my plight. And what I mean by that is, and without getting into the particulars, you can get to the website and read some of those things. I've had a life to where I felt like with my artwork, I could only, present it in a certain way, so to speak. And surfacing to me is like evolution and being, acceptance and being allowed to freely express yourself in a way. A lot of the things that I had experienced were more, while I was having, this success, if you will, all these things were kind of happening in the background. And I would come to the gallery that Rose was in, and they would never know a thing. As a matter of fact, a lot of the things that we talked about, when we were putting the website together, she didn't know about it until now. Wow. And I've known her for, like I said, about 30 years. And, and we've talked, a few times about, well, gosh, why would I never know this? And the funny thing is, when you're conditioned in a certain way, you grow up a certain way, you kind of have to, you kind of learn to, it's like, okay, you know what? This is not for this time. We're tucking this away and we're putting it in our back pocket, and we're going to let it be what it is. So if we specifically talk about this ordeal here, when I got pulled over, which by the way happened at least once a month or so, and if not more. And a lot of it, the majority of it happened between I'd say 17 to like 45. And I'm now 55. So I've been like profiled in some sort of way all the way up into about that time, So on the website, I do speak of this time that I got pulled over. In this particular, on the website, this particular one, I was at a convenience store, and I remember I went over with my friend and one of my friends, and this was this probably happened just before the gallery situation, because I remember I was just finishing up my studies in college, and we were at my apartment, and we decided to go around the corner just to get some snacks. So I go around to this convenience store, and I remember being in the aisle, and my friend was, purchasing things, and he had them at the counter, and I went to go snag some gum. And I remember holding it up and saying, hey, put this on the tab. And then the guy at the register was like, gotcha. And so we're about to walk out the store, and then all of a sudden, lights everywhere, cars come screeching in, and we're just like, okay, what's going on here? You stole gum. I said, well, officer, I have money in my pocket, and if you ask the cashier in there, they'll tell you that we didn't steal anything. So they verified the story. I said I was holding the gum up, and I told them to put it on my friend's tab. He was paying for everything. So then comes the other part that always happens when I would get pulled over. And it was like, well, I need to see your license. And I go, okay. I said, well, I just popped over from the apartment. I actually keep my wallet in my car. So I don't have it with me. And they said, well, that's okay. We'll go get it. So there's this entourage of officers and myself walking over to my car. And I'll never forget this because this was one of the first scary ones. So I have my keys to the car, and I'm about to like open up the door, and the officer is just like, freeze, and I'm just like, whoa, and I kind of turn my head to the side, and I see these guns drawn, and I was talking to the officer behind me. I was like, well, you told me to, get my wallet. So then they, made me step back and everything. And then all of a sudden they rushing in the car, and then they're like, rifling through everything, through my artwork that's in the back. Because I had told him I was an artist, and they're like, yeah, he really is an artist. And so they were rifling through like everything. They don't find anything. They did find one thing. They found my younger brother. He had these water guns, and it was one of those green Mattel guns you could see through. It even had water in it, and they confiscated it. And then there was this whole ordeal after that, where you're getting processed and things of that nature before they before they let you go. So I endured like time after time after time these sort of things, and even to the point like when my son was young, he was like 3, in the car, and I think I mentioned this on the site too. Same thing happened. I was pulling out, and I get pulled over, and there's these lights. Like at least 7 police cars behind me, and on the megaphone, it's like, get out your car, driver, put your hands out the window. And then they wanted me to take I think it was my right hand to open the door. It was some bizarre stuff, and I was like, I can't. I have my Kentucky Fried Chicken tall root beer on my lap. And so he's like, well, driver, put your drink on the floor, so then I'm like easing out the car, and and my son is seeing all these lights, and he was probably only at that time about 3 years old, and he goes, Daddy, are they going to shoot you? And I'm looking at my son, I was like, I hope not. And so when I get out the car, because you got to get out the car, and then I'm hearing traffic going by because you can't face. They're like, lace your hands, and walk backwards. And so the painting still, if you get to the site, kind of, it was like the inspired by like this particular event, so you got your hands up and you're walking backwards, and all of a sudden you just hear feet like running, and I'm like, okay, something's happening, but I don't know what's going to happen. Then all of a sudden, tackle, you're on the ground, being handcuffed and all this. And I'm asking them, well, why am I getting pulled over? Why am I getting pulled over? And there's like, well, you were driving suspiciously. And I was like, what? Like, how do you drive suspiciously? I just left Kentucky Fried Chicken, and I was driving down the street towards my house, which was not more than 2 more blocks away from me. So then this whole ordeal happens, and I got to call his mom. She's got to pick, Gabe up. And then, they're still processing me, and I'm thinking, well, this is going to be the time that I go to jail, because it was taking longer than normal. And eventually they cleared me because I didn't have a certain tattoo or something. I don't know, after they'd done their deep search. And then there's no apology or anything like that, or, hey, we got the wrong guy. It was just like, you're free to go. And then that's it. So I guess the surfacing is really, coming out on the other side of those things and reflecting back on. So there's a little of that in each of these paintings, whether it be something, like I said, that you can actually visibly see, or something that's charged by some of the ways that I apply paint, but it's in there.
I often ask just like the role of art in social justice. and a lot, and you're painting from like personal, like scary experience. And do you have a feeling about the role of art as a whole in social justice? And do you have an opinion about?
I think that for those that have experiences, I'm seeing this more so than I have, in my earlier life. I do think there's, somewhat of a responsibility, because I think the more dialogue that's out there, and whatever form it's out there, the more attention is brought to some of these things. If you go back, and I'll go back to like 30 years ago, Rodney King. If you think about that time period and you start to look at what's happening now, there's not much difference between what was happening then and what's happening now. Especially if you think of the Floyd situation. It's like, of course there was a death in this particular one, but are we in another 30 years going to look back at this one and sort of it just fades into the abyss, and there's no attention brought to it. I'm hopeful that that's not the case. And I think largely because you have a lot more eyes on it. There's a lot more video, more in your face kind of things happening. And there's a lot of people that I've talked to that have said, oh my God, I had no idea this is happening. So if I go back to like when I was telling you about when I first met Rose, a lot of these things could go on before I would come into a show or something like that. And I would never say anything about it because it was like, well, what would be the point of doing that? There was no point in taking it any further than where it went, because it is what it is, or it was what it was. And honestly, without having a lot of this, like the video things that we have now, and having it constantly in the eyes of other people, because I remember Rose saying, oh my God, I can't believe this would ever happen to, and she's not the only one, because I have a lot of friends that are like, what happened? And then the next sentence would be you. And I was like, it really doesn't matter whether you're good or bad,
Right.
It just is who you are. And that's not to say that people from other races haven't, endured the same kind of thing. I could just only go by my experience. So my responsibility may not necessarily be to, be a community activist or something like that. But the more I continue to work and grow as an artist, it's hard to escape me.
Yeah.
Because I live with me and I've been dealing with me, and there are things that are happening inside that I have to deal with. And as I told you earlier, art has always been that escape for me. So it's in there, and more of it's going to come out. And I think it's the time and it's appropriate to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that.
No, absolutely.
Yeah. I went on a tour with Rose at the Coors show. And she tells, when she was highlighting your artwork, she tells one of these stories, one of these things that happened to you. And I would say that probably the entire audience were white people.
Mm-hmm.
And as, like Wes and I, being white males, we've never experienced that. I've never been pulled over, and cuffed or detained just because of the color of my skin. I've never experienced, I don't even know what that's like. So there was definitely a collective astonishment that this goes on, and it goes on in this day and age. People don't, because they just don't know. And I was really taken aback. I can't believe that he's endured this. And, she related that it happened multiple times. And then I read the story on your website about you getting pulled over with your son in the back of the car, 3 years old. That to me was devastating. Like, I can't imagine you having to endure this all your life. Then, I guess as a father, you probably have to have this conversation with your son, this innocent child at some point, saying, look, this is the way the world is, and you need to be careful. And I can't imagine having that same conversation with my son. I've never had to do that. That's, like I said, that's devastating. It makes me sad that this is the world that we live in. And you said, you alluded to the fact that, 30 years time, not a lot has really changed. People are more, they're more aware of it.
Mm-hmm.
But yet again, here's this woman in Aurora last week or whatever it was, this Brittany Gilliam, that gets pulled over because they suspect that this car that she's driving is stolen. She's got, I think, 4 other children in the car with her, and they take her out of the car and cuff her along with these other children and point guns at these children. That's a traumatic experience that they'll have to process and carry with them for the rest of their life. That makes me incredibly sad that that's the state of the world, and that's something that you have had to endure.
Yes.
And I can say I'm sorry, but I know that doesn't fix it. So what do we do to help facilitate a better world for our friends that have experienced this?
I really think it's just awareness. I think the more people that know, because I refuse to believe that, a nation is turning a blind eye to it. I want to believe that people genuinely just have no idea that some of these things are going on, in other places. So what I'm going to assume is that. So to me, the more that this word gets out and the more that people address these things, because this is something that happens every day without cameras. And I'll tell you, especially back in the day, I would get pulled over walking on the street, accused of things. My own brother was, he was missing for like 30 days. My older brother, I'll never forget this. And we thought, like, God, what happened to him? We didn't know if he was alive or dead. When we finally got to him, now this was in Columbus, Ohio, when this happened, apparently he had been detained by police for like 30 days without any record that he was in there, because they had pepper sprayed his face so bad, like the direct blows, so where it was all bubbly and stuff like that. And he remembers telling the police, he says, "That's all right, I'm gonna let everyone know about this." And then he disappeared for 30 days. And we thought we didn't know where he was. We're filing reports, no record. He finally shows up after he's, healed up. And then it's like, well, who's gonna believe me?
Right.
That sort of thing. So my thing is, believe it. It can happen. And I'm not saying that exact thing is going on. Well, no, I'm pretty sure it can. It could happen now. But the more eyes that we can set on some of these things, that's the more awareness that we can have, throughout the nation, then and the more people can respond, to this than just the silent or the people that have been enduring these things, and there's been no voice for them. Because my voice alone is not enough. There's power in numbers. I was recently doing a clip for a painting that was collected, and it reminded me of the 60s and the civil rights movement and the marches, where there were a lot of individuals of all colors actually that got together and were really protesting some of the things that were happening then, right? And for some reason, if you think about it, the 60s all the way up to Rodney King, that was like another 30 years or something like that. Seems like it slowly died out a little bit or whatever, or maybe the awareness wasn't as stark, because John Lewis, he was a recipient, he just passed, so we were talking about some of the things that happened to him where he, got his head injury and all that stuff, so that's some real, that's some real stuff. So then you fast forward, to the King, or you fast forward to this George Floyd, these things keep happening. But why do they keep happening? And I hope it's just an awareness factor of it. But I've known all my life, because you had spoken about that talk. I had that talk with my mother and, for my mother and father when I was a young kid, if you get pulled over, keep your hands on the dash. Don't make any sudden moves. Have your registration and all your paperwork out before the police officer even gets to the car. Try not to pull over in a dark area or a secluded area. Yeah. But awareness, I think that's what it's gonna take.
And I think the problem, speaking from my culture, is we're so dismissive of it, because part of it is, I think not that they don't believe it is, but it's hard for them to wrap their head around that, every time you get pulled over, not only is it just like, I've been pulled over, but I've never once put my hands on the steering wheel or on the dash. I've never had to feel that way. And so we as white people probably totally dismiss it. And so we need this constant communication, this constant reminder, but people are so dismissive of it. And then as soon as you get any kind of pushback from the African American community or Hispanic community, then they're pissed. Mm-hmm. And now I won't watch baseball or NASCAR because of Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
And, it's just, why do you got to push back? Accept it for what it is. Try to learn from it. And let's make a better place. But they push back hard. And it's frustrating.
Now, do you think that pushback is because they don't, like you said, because they don't see it as being real, or because they've never experienced it? Do you think that's the pushback, or they don't want to see it and let's just keep things the way they are?
Right. I think it's the latter. I think they don't want to see it.
I think it's a combination.
Yeah.
They've never experienced it firsthand. They don't want to believe it. And then they don't want to have to process it and deal with it. That's somebody else's problem.
Right.
And
the whole idea of like, well, if they just cooperate, I'm sorry, that's kind of a bad term when I say they, but if he would just cooperate and be nice. But when how many times do you have to be pulled over before even being nice it doesn't make any difference. So now I react like, why the hell are you pulling me over? And then it escalates because you're not being nice. And that, and that's such a cop-out thing for white people to say, or anybody that feels that way. Well, if they would just cooperate.
But you know what? The thing is, so when I was in a situation like that, because I have a story for each situation except for the ones that get really gruesome.
Right.
I remember being pulled over, handcuffed, put in the back of a police car. And I don't know if I mentioned this on the website or not, but in this particular case, I remember asking the officer, okay, well, why am I being pulled over? Or what did I do? And when he finally got me cuffed and into the back of the car, which is very uncomfortable, by the way, because I'm like 6 foot and you can't sit straight in those cars. It's just impossible. So I'm sitting in the back sideways and I'm looking and listening to like the radio and all these things popping off, and I go, okay, so why did I get pulled over? And he says something to the effect of, well, when you have a warrant out for your arrest. And I'm like, and so I said, well, how do you get a warrant if you haven't done anything? Something like that. Then he got really sarcastic and he said, well, when you do bad things happen to you. And then I made the mistake of saying something to this effect. I kept hearing because I knew what some of the codes were for robbery and stuff like that. I said, you guys really should probably be out catching real criminals, because I'm not sure what this is all about. And he jumped out of the front seat, came around, pulled the back door open. And I remember he pulled the club that's on his side, and he raised it to my head and he like swung. And then I kind of cringed just a little bit, and then he stopped. And then he just closed the door and went back to the other side. And then from that moment on, I was kind of like, okay, this is not the thing to do. We're not going to make any comments. We're just going to be quiet. So the whole idea of cooperation to me is one of those, what does that mean?
Right. Exactly.
Exactly. You can be the most docile person. Like I don't consider myself a violent person at all. As a matter of fact, I just love on everybody, and yet if it can happen to me, imagine if it was someone that had a shorter fuse. It's like, wait a minute, as you mentioned, enough is enough. Yeah. What's the deal with this? And then it escalates, as you said, to something that becomes something that, who knows what could happen in one of those situations. And then it turns into this, well, it's like a self-defense thing, or, he was resisting arrest, and those poor children, as you mentioned. I mean, I'm sitting here feeling my sandals, which have been in the sun, and I'm touching my toes on them. They are hot as all get up. Could you imagine having to lay on that asphalt face down with that on your face?
For 45 minutes, an hour, however long it took for them to finally decide, oh, sorry,
we got the wrong number.
Yeah.
Or say someone made a quick move and you had to pull your weapon. And then you find out later it was a car from, where was it, like Montana or Nevada or something. I don't know where the license plates came from. And they had a mix up in the system. And your car happened to be that same, that's just crazy to me. Oh, that's crazy too. Boy.
Yeah, he was checking you out.
Yeah, what was that?
I think it was a yellow jacket or a wasp. Yeah, I think.
Wow.
But anyway.
I'm glad it went and you told me that, because otherwise you would have heard some interesting things on some. I had to jump to. I can handle pretty much yellow jackets for me are like.
Well, they're mean.
They are. They're vicious.
Yeah,
Little insects.
Yeah. But at any rate, so you'll find in some of the series there's going to be a little bit of that, with the exception of the Faces of Eve, and I think that was born out of a different spirit. You know, it was really this. And we were talking about women a little bit earlier. I was trying to do like my take on the whole Adam and Eve, because I'd see a lot of art, you know, with Adam, you know, and Eve, and then you'd have like the fruit and or whatever it was that she allegedly had given him to partake of. And, you know, I started looking at that whole sequence and thinking, you know, gosh, Eve gets the bad rap, man. She's like blamed for the woes of the world. And so I started seeing these correlations, you know, between how, you know, Eve's plight would be, you know, as a woman, you know, and how it related to like things of today. And so I decided to, you know, take the inspiration from that story and explore, you know, Eve. Because if you think about it, you know, the whole garden thing, you know, when they got the boot from the Garden of Eve, you know, they're like forced to fend for themselves at that point, you know. And so, you know, there's the whole childbirth thing, you know, and work in the land and all that. So, and it's no different than what we're dealing with like right now as people, and in particular women. You know, they are, we'll say that 1950s role, you know, where you were supposed to, you know, stay home and not be part of a two economy situation. You know, those days are gone. So, you know, they're just as big of participants in the economy as we are as males. And yet sometimes their salaries are, you know, not as, are comparable to what their counterparts, and they have some discrimination, you know, to deal with themselves. So that series was sort of exploring some of those ideas.
So in that same vein, these paintings that you paint, they're all very beautiful. And your work melds beauty with contemplative. I know you're a deep thinker. Have you always been in this place of reflecting of society and the world around you and roles of gender? And has that always been kind of a catalyst, a kind of simmering below the surface, you know?
Absolutely. And the funny thing is, and I don't know if it started with me just getting old, to where I feel as though, you know, I should, maybe making more of a statement about it in my work. But yeah, it started out, you know, as you mentioned, just being something as you know, as back thoughts in my mind. And, you know, as a young artist, you know, you're still really trying to figure out, you know, I think the most important thing is like, you know, figuring out technique and, you know, things that are very linear, you know, how do I apply paint? And you really don't think a whole lot about content other than, you know, it would be cool to paint that, you know, that sort of thing. So as time develops, you know, and you get past and you start to build up your intuitive, there we go again. Excuse me. You start to build up your intuitive toolbox, or just plain old experience of just being on the earth for many years. You start to, you know, have opinions. And when the whole idea of technique and, you know, application and those things fade into the background, which they should, to be true artists, that should be a secondary thing, the thing that you just draw from when your intuitive self says to draw from it. Then you have more time to think about other things like, you know, like content and things of that nature. And so some people come to that like right out of, you know, grad school or, you know, and some like myself, it takes a little bit longer. But like I've dealt with a lot of things in my life, there's a time and place for everything to happen. And I don't know if I could have had any commentary on it, you know, 20 years ago or so, or what that would have looked like 20 years ago. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, I was sort of in that phase. I'm just going to leave things alone because I don't want to stir up any, you know, drama. I'll keep my drama to myself. But you can only hold yourself in that position for so long before you have to start saying, hey, wait a minute, enough is enough. Now I got to say something about this.
And it probably reveals itself in its time.
Yes.
Yes. Like you said, when you put the process and the techniques, they become muscle memory and things like you said, you draw from, then you can be more reflective and it reveals itself in time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'd say, yes, I think I've always had these things slowly cooking, but it's not until now to where they're like simmering and boiling over, and I feel as though I can respond to them because I have a better way of doing it and a better know of how I would like to express that.
And the cool thing, if we're going to use the whole cooking metaphor, now the seasonings have really infused inside the stew and the soup, and now the flavor really becomes more stronger and more appealing.
Yes, definitely.
Did you like that?
Yes. Now he's making me hungry. No.
Well, that goes back to our discussion we had earlier about voice. That we referenced our mutual friend, Rose Frederick.
Todd, I think this is becoming a drinking game. Every time we say Rose, somebody's going to take a drink.
She'll probably like that.
Yeah.
Has it been hard with the recent work? Was it hard to embrace that portion of your voice and let that out? Because you talked about before where you just wouldn't talk about it. Was there some fear there as far as letting this out to people and letting them know what you've gone through and your experience?
Oh, absolutely. There's fear in just discovering who you are and being acceptant of whatever that is. I know that, when I was younger, you'd probably go, God, I wish I was like that, and so those things that you don't think are necessarily the right things to put out there, you try to tuck them away and hide them from people. It's like, I don't think people would like the way that looks. And in my, story, as we were talking about my early woes with, with the police or harassment and things of that nature, that would pop up often to where it became my norm to just say, you know what, that's the way it is, and we're going to tuck it away. So a lot of the things that I should have been dealing with in some way or another, I just said, we're just not doing this, and just didn't deal with it. And as I mentioned a few seconds ago, it's hard to keep that down like forever. At some point you have to let it, you have to let something out some kind of way. And maybe, some people will see a therapist. Maybe some people will, talk to their spouse more about it, or some other way, they choose to express this idea. But now, since I have, my work, and it's always been that thing for me, I feel as though it's the appropriate medium to express this in. And my hope is that, as my life has worked, people will grow with that and, accept it and perhaps embrace it. And we'll see what happens. The scary thing is you just don't know. I talked about, I was at a meeting a couple of days ago, and we were talking about this whole idea of turning a ship. I know I can't just take the ship and turn it like, okay, I'm going this way. Now I'm going, I'm going north. Now I'm going south. It's not that easy. I think it's going to have to be a gradual, shift, just like your understanding and comprehension of like some of these things that happen, out there that you may not have experienced. The first part of it is knowing that, hey, it can happen. And then the more and more you know about these things happening, the more change, because I've had friends, and I know I'm skipping back a little bit to some of the other things that we talked about, but I have friends that are now saying, I don't know what I'm going to do, but I'm definitely going to start making a move to make my voice heard in this situation. I can't believe this has happened. So the more of that I'm seeing, the more encouraged I get about what the future looks like, which is why I think this day and age is maybe a little bit different. I think there's going to be more voices that are saying, hey, this is just not right. So it's a tough thing to do when you have something that you've been tucking away, and I have this inner voice that needs to speak, and I'm still hesitant as to how much of that inner voice I let out and when I let it out. So I have to be, that's my own personal battle. So we'll see what happens with that.
You mentioned an artist that we've recently discovered on your website, and I think his work is really amazing. But again, I'm just now starting to know a little bit about him and explore his work. He's an artist by the name of Mark Bradford. What draws you to his work, and do you feel a kind of kinship to what he does, even though his work is very different from yours?
So Mark Bradford, I think I happened upon his work a few years ago, and it was reintroduced to it. Speaking of Clifford Steele, because he has some connection, with Clifford in some sort of way. He mentions him in one of his. I think it was one of his. There was like a little mini documentary or something like that. As for what he's trying to accomplish with his work, I think that we probably have, are very. I think the overall, how he speaks of some of the, civil rights things of that nature. That I am in complete agreement with. That part of it. But I think we have two different, voices as far as how we entertain that. I think what I was mentioning on the site was, if you close your eyes, and I was speaking more to whether you're black, red, white, green, as an artist, I think we are just artists, and we should be able to, reflect our art in any way we choose to, and not be, delegated into like one of these boxes. It says, oh, okay, well, that's black art. So that means, if you're a white artist, you can't do black art, or, it gets me thinking about, okay, well, wait a minute. So then if I'm a black artist, then what is white art, or what is, Hispanic art? What is, and what are those boundaries that we have to stay within and not cross those?
And there's been a lot of talk about cultural appropriation and in art and writing and that kind of stuff. So what you're talking about is very on point today.
Yeah. So if you're a person that has, I've grown up, in project situations, and I've been around people who have been in multi-million-dollar homes. So I've seen it like the full, and I've taken something from each of those situations. And I've been around every culture that you could imagine, and I draw from all of that. So if that's a part of my experience and I choose to express in that, why would you have a problem with that? I don't know. As long as I'm not being disingenuous in what I'm trying to do, like I said, I can only speak to my experiences. So if I do step into those realms, then it's because I've actually experienced something like that. But if it's something that I haven't been a part of, then I probably won't step into those into those areas. So with Mark Bradford, I was looking at one of something that was on CBS, I believe, and actually this was after I was commenting on this. And I said, if you close your eyes, then just open them and look at the work, you just see this amazing group of art works from this artist. Now, would I draw from just looking at those artworks that he was, a black artist? Maybe not, or maybe so. And if I didn't have the titles or the or his thoughts on, on each work, would I draw that information from it? As beings, we come up to a work and we look at that work and we respond to it.
And you look at it through your own experiences and filter.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So in the CBS interview, they were talking to, I don't know if it was some of the family members or some black women, and they were like, oh, I can't tell you what they're about, And maybe even from their eyes, without knowing the story behind it, they might not get anything about civil rights or social issues and things of that nature out of the work, but they can respond to it. And they were saying, oh, they love the work and that is beautiful. So the point I was making was that we first see with our eyes and our heart, and then the rest comes along. And then, so after I looked at the work and responded to it, and then saw these, and I loved them even more because I found out what the entire, what they were about in its entirety, and it just blew me away even more so. So I would say, yes, he's one that I would certainly agree with. I don't know if we're necessarily saying the exact same things, but we're moving in the same direction, I should put it that way.
I guess where I was going with that question is that your work, and I think you stated at least in one or more interviews that I've read, your work is very subtle.
Mm-hmm.
It is not like just, throwing it right there in your face, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I look at Mark Bradford's work and I kind of see the same thing. It's very subtle.
Mm-hmm.
And once you start peeling back the layers, you're like, wow, he's making a very powerful statement, but you can appreciate it on many different levels.
In that respect, yes. If you look at the work, if you look at my work, you would look at it, and there's this multi-layered sort of experience that you have with both of our works, and then you get to the core of what they're about.
Being an artist, it's not a destination, it's a journey. It's an evolution.
Absolutely.
As a person and as an exploration. At this point in your life, and you kind of alluded to it in a couple other comments you've made, do you think much about like your end game, like where you're at, your mortality, and as far as legacy is concerned?
Mm-hmm.
Does that play in that film in your head?
Yes, actually. Like I said, I'm 55 now, and you can't help but think about it because as time progresses, you lose people that you've known for forever. We are at some point going to expire. And as I mentioned, from the very, very beginning stages, once I got on the path that I'm on right now, when I said, if it's not about this, then what is it about? That was my opening to explore this lifelong journey. And what's happened for me is I started thinking about what happens as we continue to progress. And what if I was to die today or, in 15, 20, whatever, 30, what has my life been about? I would love for people to walk back into this and say, he painted with his heart. And this is his message. His message was, be true to yourself. Be good to others. And as a painter, paint your vision, paint your heart. And if you can do that, or if that's going to be said, then I think I will have accomplished what I need to accomplish.
That's phenomenal.
That's beautifully stated.
I love that, man.
Yeah.
I love you.
Oh, man, I love you too, man.
Oh, man, I usually break into that moment first.
Well, I love you too,
man. And your lovely wife just came out and brought us drinks.
Yes,
thank you so
yes.
much. On that note, Ron, I mean, it's been an absolute pleasure to spend a couple hours or whatever it's been now with you. I appreciate you taking so much time out of your day. It's the one thing that time is precious.
Yes.
And I never take that. We don't take that for granted. The fact that you're willing to take time away from your family or your work, painting today, or one of your restoration projects that I know you have going on, that means the world to us. And we, like I said, we sincerely appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure, man. My pleasure. I appreciate it. I appreciate you guys.
Yeah, this has been an absolute joy. And wow, I think you just notched up our podcast like another couple notches because you're so well spoken, so thoughtful in what you're talking about. And you can tell it comes from your heart that it's just really, it fills my soul. I can feel it just growing inside me when I hear what you're saying.
I appreciate that.
I love you too. And this has been just a great moment. So thank you so much.
Yes. And I want to also say that I appreciate you guys for coming out or even thinking about me for this particular podcast, because I think that, the more ears that we can get on to, some things that I'm doing and even some of my thoughts, the more people will be aware of it. So I just thank you guys for being you guys, because you're making the world a better place by opening up this dialogue.
I don't even know what to say, man.
Is this going to be the first time we both crying at the end of the podcast? Thank you so much.
It's all right with me, man. It's all right with me. That's that passion,
cool.
dude.
All right. Well, for the Tenet Podcast, I'm Todd Pearson.
And I'm Wes Brown.
Have a great week.